The October afternoon wore the particular golden quality that made St. Mary Mead appear to the casual visitor like something lifted from a watercolor painting, all honey-colored stone and climbing roses, with the church spire pointing toward a sky the shade of forget-me-nots. The annual harvest fete had transformed the village green into a charming tableau of English country life, complete with bunting that fluttered in the gentle breeze and the sort of cheerful bustle that spoke of traditions maintained across generations. Miss Jane Marple sat contentedly on a wooden bench near the handicraft stall, her knitting needles moving with the steady rhythm of long practice as she worked on what appeared to be a particularly intricate baby's shawl. To those who passed by, she seemed the very picture of a harmless elderly lady enjoying the afternoon's festivities, but those who knew her well understood that Miss Marple's sharp blue eyes missed nothing of significance. She had positioned herself with the strategic precision of a general surveying a battlefield, able to observe the ebb and flow of village life while appearing to be entirely absorbed in her wool work. The handicraft stall, presided over by Mrs. Dorothy Saintsbury, with the efficiency of a woman accustomed to organizing charity events, displayed the finest examples of local needlework. Quilts hung from wooden frames, their intricate patterns catching the afternoon light, while tables groaned under the weight of embroidered linens, knitted garments, and delicate lacework that represented countless hours of patient labor. But it was the centerpiece of the display that drew the most attention, an exquisite antique sewing basket of polished walnut and brass, its silk-lined interior divided into numerous compartments for threads, thimbles, and the countless small tools of the seamstress's art. "Now that," declared Mrs. Venetia Carmichael, examining the basket with the air of a connoisseur, "is a piece worth having. 18th century, I should think, and in remarkable condition." Mrs. Carmichael, who had moved to St. Mary Mead the previous spring following her husband's retirement from the Foreign Office, possessed the sort of confident authority that came from years of diplomatic entertaining. Her opinions, delivered with crisp certainty, had a way of settling matters whether others agreed or not. Mrs. Saintsbury beamed with proprietary pride. "It belonged to Miss Lavinia Greenway, you know. She left it to the church in her will, along with all her needlework supplies. Such a generous soul, though terribly particular about her stitching. She could spot an uneven seam from across a room." The quilting circle assembled. The mention of Miss Greenway drew a small crowd of the village's most accomplished needlewomen, each of whom had known the deceased spinster and had opinions about her legendary perfectionism. Mrs. Millicent Hartwell, whose own embroidery skills were considerable despite her tendency toward nervous chatter, fingered the basket's brass fittings with obvious admiration. "I remember when Lavinia first acquired this basket," she said, her voice carrying the particular satisfaction of someone sharing privileged information. "It was at an estate sale in Little Wickham. Oh, it must have been 15 years ago now. She outbid Mrs. Pemberton from Much Benham quite ruthlessly. There was quite the scene, I'm told." Mrs. Edith Pemberton, for that lady was, unfortunately for the harmony of the moment, standing directly beside Mrs. Hartwell, stiffened perceptibly. "I fail to see why acquiring a sewing basket at a legitimate auction should be considered ruthless, Millicent. Miss Greenway simply recognized quality when she saw it." The subtle chill in Mrs. Pemberton's tone would have been imperceptible to a casual observer, but Miss Marple's knitting needles paused for just a moment as she registered the undercurrent of old resentment. Mrs. Pemberton, a handsome woman in her early 60s with silver hair arranged in an elaborate coiffure, had never quite forgiven the village for various small slights, real and imagined, that had accumulated over her 20 years of residence. "Of course, dear," Mrs. Hartwell replied with the sort of bright smile that managed to be both apologetic and patronizing simultaneously. "I simply meant that Lavinia was very determined when she wanted something. We all knew how passionate she was about her needlework." Secrets in silk and thread. Miss Marple, observing this exchange with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying tribal customs, noticed several things that would prove significant later. Mrs. Pemberton's gloved hands, she observed, trembled slightly as she reached out to touch the sewing basket's silk lining, not with the tremor of age, but with something that looked remarkably like suppressed emotion. Mrs. Carmichael, meanwhile, examined the basket with an intensity that seemed excessive for mere aesthetic appreciation, her fingers tracing the brass corners with the familiarity of someone who had handled similar pieces before. "Such beautiful workmanship," murmured Miss Patience Fortescue, the village's retired schoolmistress, whose own needlework was competent if uninspired. One can see why Miss Greenway treasured it so, though I must say I always wondered why she never used it for her actual sewing. She kept it on her mantelpiece like an ornament. This observation drew sharp looks from several of the assembled ladies. Mrs. Saintsbury's smile became somewhat fixed as she replied, "Well, naturally one would want to preserve such a fine piece. Miss Greenway was always very careful with her possessions." "Careful to the point of obsession, some might say," Mrs. Pemberton remarked with a slight edge to her voice. "She wouldn't let anyone so much as touch her sewing things, most particular about keeping everything just so." The conversation might have continued in this vein of gentle malice disguised as fond remembrance, but it was interrupted by the arrival of young Dr. Geoffrey Sandford, who approached the handicraft stall with the slightly harried air of a man fulfilling social obligations under duress. The village's newest resident, having taken over the practice from the elderly Dr. Haydock just 6 months earlier, was still finding his footing in the complex social hierarchy of St. Mary Mead. "Ladies," he said with a polite nod, "I hope you're all enjoying the fete. Mrs. Saintsbury, my housekeeper mentioned that you might have some recommendations for someone to help with mending. I'm afraid I'm rather hopeless with a needle myself." Mrs. Saintsbury was about to reply when Mrs. Carmichael interjected smoothly, "How thoughtful of you to ask, Doctor, though I'm sure any of us would be delighted to help. After all, we must look after our medical man." Her smile was warm, but Miss Marple noticed that it didn't quite reach her eyes. The first thread unravels. It was at this moment that Mrs. Hartwell, in her enthusiasm to demonstrate the sewing basket's various compartments to Dr. Sandford, lifted the silk-lined tray to reveal the deeper storage area beneath. What she found there caused her to emit a small, startled gasp that drew the immediate attention of everyone present. "Oh my," she whispered, her face draining of color. "How very odd." Nestled in the bottom of the basket, partially concealed beneath a fold of the silk lining, lay a small bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. The paper was yellowed with age, and the handwriting visible on the topmost envelope was distinctly feminine, written in the sort of elaborate script that had been fashionable 40 years earlier. Mrs. Pemberton reached for the letters with a movement so swift it was almost predatory, but Mrs. Saintsbury was faster. "I think," she said with the firm authority of someone accustomed to managing church affairs, "that these should be examined by the proper authorities before anyone else handles them." The small crowd that had gathered around the sewing basket fell silent, each person lost in their own thoughts about what secrets the letters might contain. Miss Marple, her knitting now completely forgotten, observed the play of expressions across the various faces with the keen attention of someone who understood that in a village like St. Mary Mead, old letters rarely contained anything as innocent as recipes or weather observations. Dr. Sandford, perhaps sensing the sudden tension, cleared his throat diplomatically. Perhaps the vicar should be consulted. As executor of Miss Greenway's estate, he would be the appropriate person to decide what should be done with any personal effects. "An excellent suggestion," Mrs. Carmichael agreed, though her eyes remained fixed on the letters with an intensity that Miss Marple found most interesting indeed. Though one does wonder what poor Lavinia was keeping hidden away in there. She always seemed such an open book. Mrs. Pemberton's laugh held no humor whatsoever. "My dear Venetia, in my experience, it's precisely the people who seem most transparent who harbor the most fascinating secrets. Still waters, as they say, run deepest." As the group began to disperse, each lady no doubt eager to share this intriguing development with friends and neighbors. Miss Marple remained on her bench, her knitting needles once again clicking steadily. But her mind was far from the pattern she was creating. Instead, she was thinking about sewing baskets and hidden letters, about the curious intensity with which Mrs. Carmichael had examined the antique piece, and about the way Mrs. Pemberton's hands had trembled when she touched the silk lining. In her long experience, Miss Marple had learned that when old secrets surfaced in a place like St. Mary Mead, trouble was rarely far behind. And as the golden afternoon light began to fade toward evening, she couldn't shake the feeling that this particular harvest fete was destined to be remembered for reasons far more sinister than prize-winning preserves and perfect needlework. The sewing basket sat innocently on its display table, its brass fittings gleaming in the lamplight that had begun to supplement the dying daylight. But Miss Marple knew, with the certainty that came from decades of observing human nature, that some secrets, once disturbed, have a way of unraveling far more than anyone expects. By Sunday morning, news of the mysterious letters had woven itself through St. Mary Mead like morning mist through garden hedges, touching everything, altering perspectives and leaving nothing quite as it had been the evening before. At the post office, Mrs. Weatherby confided to early customers that the correspondence was undoubtedly foreign and scandalous. At the baker's, Mr. Hartwell declared them to be unpaid debts, which amounted to much the same thing in terms of village interest. Mrs. Millicent Hartwell, pale with the importance of her discovery, added embellishments with each telling as though she were adding delicate stitches to an already intricate pattern. The telephone lines hummed with speculation, and more than one breakfast grew cold as housewives lingered over their morning gossip. Miss Marple, deadheading roses in her front garden, heard 3 different versions of events before 9 o'clock, each more elaborate than the last. She noted with quiet amusement how quickly fact transformed into fiction when filtered through the village's collective imagination. The vicar's burden. Reverend Leonard Clement received the sewing basket from Mrs. Saintsbury with the reluctant air of a man accepting an unexploded ordinance. In his study, surrounded by theological texts and parish records, he carefully untied the faded blue ribbon with hands that trembled slightly, not from age, but from the weight of unwanted responsibility. The letters, 7 in total, spanned nearly 4 decades, the earliest, dated 1943, and the most recent from just 18 months prior. Written in an elegant feminine hand, they were signed simply, "Your devoted V." As the vicar read, his expression grew increasingly troubled. The correspondence spoke of clandestine meetings, of a love that dared not speak its name in public, and of financial arrangements that suggested something far more complex than simple romance. "My dearest Lavinia," read one particularly revealing passage, "the walnut casket serves us well. Who would think to look for secrets in something so openly displayed? The arrangement we discussed must continue until M is no longer a threat to either of us." Mrs. Saintsbury, who had remained to witness the examination, leaned forward with poorly concealed curiosity. "Nothing too shocking, I hope, Vicar." Reverend Clement cleared his throat diplomatically. "The correspondence appears to be of a rather personal nature. Love letters, though the circumstances described are somewhat complicated." He paused, clearly struggling with the ethical implications. "There are references to financial matters, and to someone identified only as Iam." The final letter, dated just 18 months earlier, spoke ominously of decisions that could no longer be postponed and of truths that must finally come to light, regardless of the consequences to us both. Ripples of unease. Across the village, the discovery's effects were already manifesting in curious ways. Mrs. Venetia Carmichael had cancelled her usual Sunday morning walk, claiming a sudden headache, though her maid reported seeing her pacing the drawing room like a caged animal. When Dr. Sanford called to check on her condition, she had questioned him with surprising intensity about the vicar's plans for the letters. Mrs. Edith Pemberton, meanwhile, had thrown herself into aggressive garden work, directing her gardener to prune the hedge with military precision. When Mrs. Hartwell ventured to mention the morning's excitement, Mrs. Pemberton's response was sharp enough to cut glass. "Some secrets are better left buried, Millicent. Not everything benefits from exposure to daylight." Dr. Sanford, making his rounds, discovered that every patient seemed to have developed theories about the letter's contents. Mrs. Briggs, his housekeeper, volunteered that Miss Greenway had once received regular visits from a lady in a motor car, always on Thursday afternoons, always staying exactly 1 hour. The observer's eye. Miss Marple, settling into her favorite armchair with her knitting, reflected on the morning's revelations with the satisfaction of someone watching a familiar pattern emerge. She had noticed Mrs. Hartwell's observation about recognizing the handwriting, a detail that would prove significant. The elaborate script, with its old-fashioned flourishes, was indeed distinctive. More intriguing still were the reactions of her neighbors. Mrs. Carmichael's sudden indisposition, Mrs. Pemberton's aggressive defensiveness, and the way several villagers had found urgent reasons to visit the vicarage throughout the morning, all suggested that the letter's contents were far from ancient history. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the village green, Miss Marple continued her methodical knitting, her needles clicking in steady rhythm. But her mind was busy with a different sort of pattern entirely, one involving walnut sewing baskets, mysterious correspondence, and the curious way that old secrets, once disturbed, had a tendency to create entirely new problems for the living. The vicarage study held the particular stillness that accompanies weighty decisions, its familiar scents of beeswax and old leather providing little comfort to Reverend Clement as he contemplated the bundle of letters that had transformed his quiet Monday morning into something resembling a tribunal. Miss Marple arrived precisely at 10:30, carrying a small jar of her famous damson preserves and the sort of gentle demeanor that encouraged confidences without demanding them. Griselda Clement, pouring tea with the practiced efficiency of a vicar's wife, observed dryly that the parish seemed to expect their clergy to manage souls and scandals with equal expertise. Miss Marple, settling into the chair by the window where the morning light fell most kindly, murmured that both required similar skills of observation and patience. The vicar, looking as though he had wrestled with his conscience throughout the night, spread the letters carefully across his desk. "I cannot read them aloud, Miss Marple, but I may share their general nature. They speak of affection, certainly, but also of secrecy and financial arrangements that seem rather more complex than simple romance." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused almost imperceptibly as she noted the vicar's careful choice of words. "Financial arrangements often complicate the simplest human emotions," she observed mildly. "One finds that money has a way of transforming affection into something rather less pleasant." The correspondence, as the vicar explained, detailed a relationship conducted in shadows over nearly 4 decades. The mysterious V wrote of meetings in carefully chosen locations, of money placed where M cannot touch it, and repeatedly referenced the walnut casket as though it held significance beyond mere storage. Most troubling was the final letter, written 18 months prior, which spoke ominously of decisions that could no longer be delayed and truths that must finally see daylight, whatever the cost to us both. Griselda, crossing her ankles with elegant precision, remarked that truth arriving on schedule would be considerably more convenient for all concerned. Miss Marple smiled at this, while privately noting that the blue ribbon binding the letters showed signs of recent handling. The silk was too smooth, too carefully arranged to have remained undisturbed for months. The handwriting itself told its own story to Miss Marple's experienced eye. The elaborate script belonged to an earlier generation's education, with flourishes that spoke of pride and formality. More intriguingly, the pressure varied throughout the letters, suggesting they had been written under different emotional states, though always with the same careful attention to appearance. By noon, The village's reaction to Sunday's carefully worded announcement had crystallized into distinct patterns of behavior that Miss Marple found most illuminating. Mrs. Pemberton had taken to aggressive gardening, directing her staff with military precision while maintaining that some secrets were better left buried. Mrs. Venetia Carmichael had cancelled her usual social rounds, claiming indisposition, though her maid reported seeing her pacing the drawing room like something caged. Dr. Sanford, making his morning calls, discovered that every patient had developed theories about the letter's significance. Mrs. Briggs, his housekeeper, volunteered that Miss Greenway had received regular Thursday afternoon visits from a lady in a distinctive blue motor car, always precisely 1 hour, always conducted with the utmost discretion. The arrival of Inspector Craddock from Much Benham shortly after luncheon confirmed that the matter had moved beyond village gossip into official channels. Mrs. Pemberton's formal complaint about impropriety had triggered a police inquiry that the inspector approached with methodical thoroughness. His preliminary assessment, shared with the vicar and a quietly attentive Miss Marple, suggested the letters documented either a long-standing affair or a more complex arrangement involving financial coercion. The inspector's attention quickly focused on Mr. George Medway, whose contemporary relationship with Miss Greenway and considerable wealth made him an obvious candidate for the mysterious M. Medway's vehement denials and indignant bluster only served to reinforce official suspicion, creating the sort of neat resolution that satisfied bureaucratic requirements. Miss Marple, however, remained unconvinced by such tidy conclusions. Her decades of observing human nature had taught her that obvious suspects often served as convenient distractions from more subtle truths. She thought instead of Mrs. Pemberton's trembling hands on the sewing basket's silk lining, of Mrs. Carmichael's intense examination of the antique piece, and of the way certain villagers had found urgent reasons to visit the vicarage since the letter's discovery. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the village green, Miss Marple continued her methodical knitting while contemplating the curious mathematics of human relationships. 7 letters signed V, spanning 4 decades, hidden in a sewing basket that had been displayed openly for 15 years. The contradiction suggested someone who understood that the best hiding places were often in plain sight, a lesson that applied as much to people as to objects. The mystery was deepening rather than clarifying, and Miss Marple suspected that the most dangerous secrets were still safely buried beneath St. Mary Mead's placid surface. Inspector Craddock's methodical approach to questioning had produced the sort of neat conclusions that satisfied bureaucratic requirements while leaving more observant minds distinctly unsettled. His interview with Mr. George Medway at the Rose and Crown had been conducted with professional thoroughness, though the results proved less illuminating than the inspector had hoped. Medway, whose florid complexion and blustering manner suggested a man unaccustomed to having his word questioned, had admitted to regular social contact with Miss Greenway, while vehemently denying any romantic involvement or knowledge of mysterious correspondence. The retired industrialist's explanation for the financial references in the letters struck Craddock as plausible, if uninspiring. Miss Greenway had occasionally sought his investment advice, nothing more scandalous than that. His indignation at being cast as the threatening M was magnificent in its scope, complete with threats of legal action and appeals to his unblemished reputation. Yet something in his manner suggested relief rather than genuine outrage, as though the inspector's focus on him provided welcome misdirection from more uncomfortable truths. Miss Marple, who had encountered the inspector emerging from the inn with the satisfied air of a man whose paperwork was nearly complete, found herself troubled by details that seemed to escape official attention. Medway's surprise at learning about the letters had appeared genuine, his confusion too complete to be manufactured convincingly. More significantly, his physical description bore no resemblance to the mysterious Thursday afternoon visitor that several villagers had mentioned. Mrs. Briggs had been quite specific about the elegant lady in the blue motor car, while Medway drove a distinctive green Bentley that half the village could identify from its distinctive engine note. The subsequent interviews had produced a fascinating array of observations, contradictions, and carefully omitted details. Mrs. Pemberton, questioned in her immaculate drawing-room, had acknowledged knowing Miss Greenway socially while claiming complete ignorance of any romantic entanglements. Her assertion that some secrets were better left buried had struck the inspector as the sort of philosophical observation elderly ladies were prone to making, though the vehemence behind her words suggested something more personal than mere sentiment. Dr. Sanford's contribution proved unexpectedly valuable in ways the inspector didn't immediately appreciate. As Miss Greenway's physician during her final years, he had documented increasing anxiety and what he diplomatically termed nervous agitation whenever certain topics arose in conversation. His prescription records revealed sleeping, powders for insomnia that seemed to coincide suspiciously with the mysterious visitor's regular Thursday appearances, suggesting that whatever transpired during those meetings was causing Miss Greenway considerable distress rather than providing the comfort one might expect from romantic correspondence. Mrs. Venetia Carmichael's interview had presented the inspector with his most diplomatically challenging subject. Her expertise in antique furnishings explained her particular interest in the sewing basket, and her suggestion that the letters might represent a business arrangement rather than romance struck Craddock as sophisticated insight. Yet Miss Marple, observing Mrs. Carmichael's careful responses, noted something rehearsed about her answers, as though she had anticipated this conversation and prepared accordingly. It was while reflecting on these interviews that Miss Marple's methodical mind seized upon a detail that everyone else had overlooked. Mrs. Hartwell, in her eagerness to share knowledge at the fete, had explicitly stated that Miss Greenway had acquired the walnut sewing basket at an estate sale 15 years ago now. Yet the vicar had confirmed that the earliest letter was dated 1943, with others spanning nearly 4 decades. The arithmetic was troubling. How could correspondence covering 40 years be hidden in a container that had only been in Miss Greenway's possession for 15? The discrepancy nagged at Miss Marple with the persistence of a dropped stitch in an otherwise perfect pattern. Either the letters had been stored elsewhere for 25 years before being transferred to the basket, or, and this possibility was far more disquieting, someone other than Miss Greenway had placed them there, possibly quite recently. The implications transformed the entire investigation, shifting focus from the identity of the mysterious M to the identity of whoever had chosen to reveal these secrets now. By evening, the village had settled into the comfortable rhythm of scandal digested and theories refined. The inspector's preliminary report centered on Medway as the most likely candidate for blackmail or romantic entanglement gone wrong, a conclusion that satisfied official requirements while advancing the truth very little. Miss Marple, however, found herself increasingly convinced that the real mystery lay not in 40-year-old correspondence, but in the much more recent decision to ensure its discovery. The sewing basket sat in the vicarage study, its brass fittings gleaming innocently in the lamplight, while somewhere in St. Mary Mead, someone who understood the mathematics of secrets and timing was undoubtedly congratulating themselves on a plan proceeding exactly as intended. The revelation struck Miss Marple with the quiet certainty of a perfectly executed stitch falling into place. She sat in her garden on Tuesday morning, ostensibly deadheading the late roses, but actually contemplating the troubling arithmetic that had kept her awake much of the previous night. The mathematics were simple enough for a child's primaire, yet their implications transformed everything she thought she understood about the mysterious letters. Mrs. Hartwell had been quite specific at the harvest fete. Miss Greenway had acquired the walnut sewing basket 15 years ago now at an estate sale in Little Wickham. Miss Marple had learned to trust village memories about significant acquisitions, particularly when they involved outbidding rivals and creating lasting resentments. Yet the vicar had confirmed that the earliest letter was dated 1943, with others spanning nearly 4 decades. The contradiction was mathematically impossible to reconcile unless one accepted a far more disturbing conclusion. The letters had not resided in that sewing basket for 40 years. Someone had placed them there recently, deliberately, with the specific intention of ensuring their discovery at the harvest fete. This transformed the entire investigation from a passive uncovering of old secrets into an active, calculated revelation orchestrated by someone very much alive and pursuing their own agenda. Miss Marple's contemplation was interrupted by Mrs. Hartwell's arrival, the woman's nervous energy having reached fever pitch overnight. Her recollections had sharpened with anxiety, producing details that cast Miss Greenway's final months in an entirely different light. The deceased spinster had spoken urgently to Dr. Sanford about making arrangements and ensuring certain matters would be properly handled after I'm gone. Most significantly, she had repeatedly referenced the walnut piece and something called Thursday's difficulty, phrases that suggested deliberate planning rather than casual conversation. Dr. Sanford's morning rounds had yielded their own disturbing observations. His visit to Mrs. Carmichael revealed a woman in considerable distress, her hands showing the fine tremor associated with extreme stress rather than age. Her questions about the investigation had been unnaturally specific, focusing on whether the police had identified the letter writer and what measures might protect innocent parties from unnecessary scandal. When he had gently suggested she might benefit from discussing her concerns, her response had been sharp enough to draw blood. Some confessions, she declared, created more problems than they solved. Inspector Craddock's methodical investigation, meanwhile, had begun to unravel his initial assumptions about Medway's involvement. The timing of the mysterious Thursday visits coincided precisely with Medway's weekly bridge games at his club in Much Benham, an alibi confirmed by multiple witnesses and meticulously recorded in the club's social calendar. More troubling still, the post office revealed that Miss Greenway had never received mail from anyone signing themselves V through official channels, suggesting the correspondence had been delivered personally by someone with regular, unremarkable access to her home. That afternoon, Miss Marple requested the sewing basket from the vicar for proper examination of the silk lining, a request so reasonable that refusal would have seemed churlish. In a sitting room where the light fell most kindly on delicate work, she discovered what everyone else had missed. The rose-pink silk had been recently restitched, the thread too bright and the technique distinctly different from Miss Greenway's legendary perfectionism. This was loose, overcast work, swiftly done and slanted in a way that suggested a left-handed seamstress. Beneath the padded edge, her careful needle struck paper. A small packet wrapped in waxed tissue containing a brass key stamped with the figures 27 and a slip bearing 2 words in familiar feminine script. Casket. Safe. The discovery confirmed her suspicions about bank deposit boxes and hidden arrangements, while the key's pristine condition suggested recent handling rather than decades of storage. Her methodical mind catalogued the village's left-handed residents with the precision of a naturalist classifying specimens. Mrs. Carmichael wore her wristwatch on her right arm and had cut the harvest fete cake with obvious left-handed competence. Mrs. Saintsbury later confirmed that Mrs. Carmichael had once brought alterations, pinning with her left hand in a way that threw me out completely. By evening, the village had settled into the comfortable rhythm of scandal digested, but Miss Marple remained troubled by the deliberate nature of the revelation. Someone had orchestrated this discovery with theatrical precision, timing the letter's emergence to coincide with maximum exposure and minimum opportunity for private resolution. The question was not merely who had written the correspondence, but who had chosen to weaponize it now, and against whom. As darkness fell across St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected that the most dangerous secrets were often those that emerged not by accident, but by design. Someone in their quiet village had decided that the time had come for old truths to surface, regardless of the consequences to innocent parties. The game, she realized with characteristic understatement, was now truly afoot. Wednesday morning arrived with the sort of persistent drizzle that made St. Mary Mead appear softly blurred around the edges, as though the village itself were reluctant to face whatever revelations the day might bring. Miss Marple, having spent a restless night contemplating the implications of her discovery, wrapped the brass key and its accompanying slip in her best linen handkerchief, and made her way to the vicarage with the measured pace of someone who understood that hasty actions often produced unfortunate consequences. Reverend Clement received her with the relief of a man who had been hoping for guidance without quite knowing how to ask for it. The key, gleaming dully in the morning light that filtered through his study windows, represented both opportunity and obligation in ways that made him distinctly uncomfortable. Griselda, pouring tea with her usual efficiency, observed that mysteries had a way of multiplying rather than diminishing once one began examining them closely, a comment that proved more prophetic than anyone realized at the time. Inspector Craddock's arrival from Much Benham brought the sort of methodical professionalism that Miss Marple found both reassuring and slightly limiting. His examination of the key was thorough, his questions about the restitched lining precise, and his interest in left-handed seamstresses gratifyingly keen. However, his insistence on proper procedures meant that any investigation of Deposit Box 27 would require appropriate warrants and bank cooperation, processes that could take days to arrange properly. Miss Marple, agreeing with characteristic warmth to avoid any unauthorized inquiries, nevertheless found herself with a small jar of damson preserves and an urgent need to check on Mrs. Carmichael's continued indisposition. The walk to Rosemary Cottage took her past Mrs. Davies' house, where that lady's encyclopedic knowledge of village genealogy provided some illuminating context delivered with the casual authority of someone who had made local history her particular specialty. The Greenway family, Mrs. Davies explained over her second cup of morning tea, were always rather reserved people, though Lavinia was the more sociable of the two sisters. Violet was the younger by some years, a talented needlewoman but given to what my mother called artistic temperament. She left St. Mary Mead rather suddenly in the late 1940s. There was some sort of disagreement with Lavinia, though nobody ever learned the precise nature of it. Family matters, you know, can be terribly complicated. The information about a younger sister named Violet provided intriguing possibilities, though Miss Marple's practical mind noted that 40 years was ample time for people to change beyond easy recognition. More immediately relevant was Mrs. Davies' confirmation that Violet Greenway had indeed been left-handed, a detail that had apparently caused some difficulty during her childhood education when such preferences were considered unfortunate habits to be corrected. Mrs. Carmichael received Miss Marple in a drawing-room that showed signs of hasty tidying, though whether from embarrassment at her continued indisposition or anxiety about unexpected visitors remained unclear. Her gratitude for the damson preserves seemed genuine enough, but her conversation carried the careful quality of someone who had rehearsed responses to anticipated questions. When Miss Marple mentioned, quite casually, how beautifully she had managed the cake-cutting at the fete, Mrs. Carmichael's explanation about being partially ambidextrous came too quickly and with too much detail for complete comfort. My father insisted I learn to use both hands properly, she explained, her left hand steady on her teacup while her right smoothed an imaginary crease in her skirt. He believed it showed proper discipline and would prove useful in later life, though I must say I found it more of a curiosity than a practical advantage. The conversation turned, as Miss Marple had hoped it would, to the matter of the mysterious letters and their potential impact on innocent parties. Mrs. Carmichael's concern seemed focused less on the romantic implications than on the possibility that Certain financial arrangements might be misunderstood by people unfamiliar with the complexities of managing modest inheritances and charitable obligations. Poor Lavinia was always so careful about appearances, Mrs. Carmichael observed, her voice carrying what might have been genuine sympathy. She understood that in a village like this, even the most innocent arrangements can be misconstrued if presented in the wrong light. I do hope the vicar will handle matters with appropriate discretion. By afternoon, Inspector Craddock had made preliminary contact with the Much Benham branch of Midland Bank, where the manager's cooperation revealed that Deposit Box 27 did indeed exist and had been visited recently, specifically on the Thursday before the harvest fete. The visitor had been a lady of middle years who had presented proper identification and signed the register with what the clerk described as a very elegant hand, quite old-fashioned in style. The timing was significant enough to warrant further investigation, though the bank's policies regarding customer privacy meant that any detailed examination of the box's contents would require additional legal procedures. What Craddock could confirm was that the box had been registered under dual signatures, requiring 2 authorized parties for access, an arrangement that suggested either extreme caution or mutual distrust between the parties involved. Miss Marple, reflecting on the day's discoveries while tending her evening knitting, found herself increasingly convinced that the Harvest Fete revelation had been orchestrated with theatrical precision. Someone had wanted those letters discovered, but in a controlled manner that would satisfy certain requirements while protecting more dangerous secrets. The question was whether that someone had been Miss Greenway herself, acting to forestall greater revelations, or another party entirely, pursuing their own agenda with calculated ruthlessness. The brass key sat in Inspector Craddock's evidence envelope, but Miss Marple suspected that the real key to the mystery lay not in bank deposit boxes, but in understanding the precise relationship between fear, loyalty, and the sort of desperation that drove ordinarily careful people to take extraordinary risks. Thursday morning brought Inspector Craddock to the vicarage with the sort of grim efficiency that suggested developments both significant and troubling. The warrant for Deposit Box 27 had arrived with the first post, along with a formal request for Miss Marple's assistance in what he diplomatically termed matters requiring local knowledge and delicate handling. The drive to Much Benham took place in thoughtful silence, both passengers contemplating how quickly village secrets could transform from gossip into criminal investigation. The Midland Bank's manager, Mr. Pembroke, received them with the professional courtesy of a man who understood that police attention rarely enhanced an institution's reputation. His examination of the signature register revealed 3 visits during the past month, always on Thursday afternoons, always signed with an elaborate V. Carmichael that belonged to an earlier generation's penmanship instruction. The timing was significant. Each visit had preceded the mysterious Thursday afternoon disturbances that had so troubled Miss Greenway during her final months. Deposit Box 27 contained revelations that transformed the entire investigation, from romantic intrigue into something far more complex. Along with additional correspondence spanning 4 decades, there were bank statements documenting regular transfers that painted a disturbing picture of financial obligation stretched across generations. Most significantly, the legal documents establishing Mrs. Venetia Carmichael as the former Violet Greenway, who had changed her name following her marriage to Colonel Reginald Carmichael in 1952, confirmed Miss Marple's growing suspicions about carefully constructed identities. The letters, examined in chronological sequence, revealed a relationship that had evolved from sisterly affection into something resembling financial coercion. Early correspondence spoke of gratitude for Lavinia's discretion regarding the unfortunate business and appreciation for her willingness to provide suitable explanations for Violet's sudden departure from St. Mary Mead. Later letters documented increasing resentment about monthly payments that had begun as voluntary assistance but had transformed into perpetual obligation. "My dearest Lavinia, read one particularly revealing passage from 1979. Your insistence on these arrangements grows more burdensome each year. The past should remain buried, not continue to drain our resources indefinitely. Surely the time has come for both of us to move forward, rather than dwelling on matters best forgotten. Miss Greenway's responses, carbon copies filed with methodical precision, revealed someone who understood the power of secrets and was not above using that understanding to maintain comfortable circumstances. Inspector Craddock's examination of financial records revealed payments totaling nearly £28,000 over the decades, a substantial drain on even a military pension. More troubling was Miss Greenway's final letter, dated 3 weeks before her death, threatening to make certain arrangements permanent unless the payments continued indefinitely, suggesting she had attempted to establish claims that would survive her own passing. The return journey to St. Mary Mead provided opportunity for reflection on the particular cruelty of transforming family bonds into financial weapons. Miss Marple found herself thinking about the mathematics of blackmail, how small secrets, properly maintained, could yield decades of steady income while destroying the very relationships they claimed to protect. The sewing basket's placement at the harvest fete now appeared less accidental discovery than calculated revelation, timed to expose secrets while protecting the revealer's identity. Mrs. Carmichael's cottage stood empty, her blue motor car absent from its usual position beside the garden gate. The maid's explanation that her mistress had departed suddenly for London to attend urgent family business struck both visitors as suspiciously convenient, particularly given the timing. A search conducted with proper warrants revealed a sewing room equipped with professional supplies and several pieces demonstrating exceptional ambidextrous skill, the sort of adaptability that might prove useful when creating false impressions about one's natural preferences. More significantly, they discovered a partially completed letter addressed to the county newspaper's editor detailing Miss Greenway's long history of financial impropriety and moral manipulation. The letter's existence suggested Mrs. Carmichael had been preparing her own narrative strategy, perhaps intending to destroy her sister's reputations posthumously while establishing herself as the wronged party in their decades-long conflict. By evening, the village buzzed with news of Mrs. Carmichael's sudden departure and the police interest in her cottage. Miss Marple, settling into her familiar armchair with her knitting, reflected on how the most dangerous family secrets were often those that transformed love into leverage, creating relationships that poisoned everyone they touched while appearing perfectly normal to casual observers. Yet something about the neat resolution troubled her methodical mind. The evidence was almost too convenient, the narrative too complete for comfort. The brass key sat in Inspector Craddock's evidence envelope, but Miss Marple suspected the real key to understanding lay not in bank deposits, but in recognizing when apparent solutions served to conceal more dangerous truths. Someone had orchestrated this revelation with theatrical precision, but whether that someone was Violet Carmichael or another party entirely remained an open question that would require considerably more delicate investigation to resolve properly. Friday morning brought Inspector Craddock back to St. Mary Mead with the sort of methodical determination that suggested official satisfaction with the case's apparent resolution, yet Miss Marple detected something in his manner that spoke of unfinished business. The evidence against Mrs. Venetia Carmichael, or Violet Greenway, as she had once been, was comprehensive enough to satisfy bureaucratic requirements, but the inspector's years of experience had taught him to distrust solutions that appeared too convenient, particularly when they involved the sort of elaborate deceptions that required both opportunity and considerable planning. The morning's first revelation came through Mrs. Saintsbury's careful recollection of the harvest fete's set-up procedures. Mrs. Carmichael had indeed volunteered to help arrange the handicraft stall, showing particular interest in the positioning of donated items and suggesting that Miss Greenway's sewing basket would make an attractive centerpiece for the display. What had seemed helpful community spirit now appeared calculated to ensure maximum exposure for whatever the basket might contain, though this raised troubling questions about why someone would orchestrate their own incrimination with such theatrical precision. Miss Marple, examining these details with her characteristic attention to human psychology, found herself increasingly troubled by the mathematical impossibilities that no one else seemed to address seriously. The letters spanned 40 years, yet the sewing basket had been in Miss Greenway's possession for only 15. Either the correspondence had been stored elsewhere for 25 years before being transferred to the basket, or someone had placed them there recently with the specific intention of ensuring their discovery at precisely the right moment. The inconsistencies mount. Inspector Craddock's more detailed examination of the evidence revealed additional troubling inconsistencies that cast doubt on the neat resolution everyone seemed eager to accept. The handwriting analysis, while confirming Mrs. Carmichael's identity as Violet Greenway, also revealed subtle variations in pressure and letter formation that suggested some of the correspondence had been written under emotional duress rather than as voluntary communication. More significantly, the financial records showed irregular payments that often coincided with specific events, family emergencies, changes in circumstances, or periods when Mrs. Carmichael had needed to establish her credentials in new communities. Dr. Sanford's contribution proved particularly illuminating when examined more carefully. His professional visits during Mrs. Carmichael's supposed illness had revealed genuine distress, but her anxiety had focused less on her own condition than on whether certain arrangements would be properly understood by the authorities. Her questions about legal procedures and evidence requirements had been surprisingly sophisticated for someone claiming ignorance of criminal matters, suggesting either extensive preparation or previous experience with such situations. Most troubling was the timing of Miss Greenway's medical prescriptions for anxiety medication. Rather than coinciding with the mysterious Thursday afternoon visits as initially assumed, they corresponded with dates when Mrs. Carmichael had been observed in lengthy conversations with other village residents. The pattern suggested that Miss Greenway's distress was caused not by her sister's visits, but by learning about her sister's activities with other members of the community, activities that may have threatened carefully maintained secrets. Alternative perspectives emerge. Mrs. Pemberton's sharp observations about Mrs. Carmichael's supposed expertise in antique furnishings provided another thread in the increasingly complex pattern. Her memory for detail, honed by decades of social observation, had retained specific inconsistencies in Mrs. Carmichael's behavior at the harvest fete. When Mrs. Pemberton had mentioned that the sewing basket's brass fittings were clearly Victorian replacements rather than original 18th century work, Mrs. Carmichael had agreed immediately, rather than offering the correction a genuine expert would have provided. This revelation prompted Miss Marple to reconsider Mrs. Carmichael's entire presentation at the fete. Her examination of the sewing basket had indeed been intense, but perhaps not with the appreciation of a collector. Rather, it had resembled someone searching for specific evidence while attempting to appear casually interested. The behavior of someone who knew exactly what the basket contained, but needed to establish plausible reasons for her knowledge without appearing too informed. More significantly, Mrs. Pemberton's own behavior warranted closer examination. Her trembling hands when touching the basket's silk lining, her immediate defensive response about some secrets being better left buried, and her particular vehemence about the impropriety of the entire situation suggested emotional investment that went beyond mere community concern. Miss Marple recalled observing Mrs. Pemberton at various village events over the years, noting her left-handed competence and her tendency toward what might charitably be called strong opinions about social proprieties. The pattern becomes clearer. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the village green, Miss Marple reflected on the particular psychology of revenge, how it often required patience, planning, and the ability to use others' legitimate secrets as cover for more dangerous deceptions. The evidence against Mrs. Carmichael was real enough, documenting a relationship that had indeed involved financial coercion over decades. But that evidence was being used to conceal something far more sinister, a pattern of manipulation that had transformed multiple lives while appearing to target only the obvious victim. The sewing basket itself had become a stage prop in a drama meticulously directed by someone who understood human nature well enough to make others dance to their tune. The discovery had been orchestrated with the precision of a theatrical production, timed to occur when maximum suspicion would fall upon the most obvious suspect while deflecting attention from more subtle manipulations. Inspector Craddock, reviewing his notes with growing unease, began to appreciate Miss Marple's concerns about the case's convenient resolution. The question was not whether Violet Greenway had been blackmailed by her sister. That much was clearly documented. But whether someone else had been using that relationship to conceal their own criminal activities, orchestrating revelations with the precision of a master puppeteer pulling strings from carefully concealed positions. As evening approached, Miss Marple sat in her familiar chair with her knitting, her needles moving in steady rhythm while her mind worked through the increasingly complex pattern of deception and misdirection. The truth, she suspected, lay not in the obvious guilt of the fled suspect, but in understanding who had possessed both the knowledge and the motivation to transform old family secrets into weapons of contemporary destruction. Saturday morning brought Inspector Craddock to St. Mary Mead with news that transformed the investigation's entire complexion, though not in ways that provided the comfortable resolution he had initially hoped to achieve. His telegram from London confirmed that Mrs. Venetia Carmichael had been located at a modest hotel in Bloomsbury, where she had registered under her maiden name and spent the previous days in a state of considerable distress, alternating between defiant justifications of her conduct and tearful admissions about the complexity of family relationships that had soured beyond redemption. Her account, delivered with the exhausted honesty of someone who had finally abandoned pretense, painted a picture that was both more and less damning than the evidence suggested. She acknowledged the financial arrangements documented in the letters, describing them as payments that had begun voluntarily but had gradually transformed into something resembling tribute extracted through emotional manipulation rather than legal threats. Miss Greenway, according to her sister's version, had possessed an almost supernatural ability to make generosity feel like obligation, transforming what should have been temporary assistance into permanent financial bondage through carefully deployed guilt and social pressure. Miss Marple, receiving this news over her morning tea, found herself thinking about the particular psychology of family blackmail, how it operated through love, corrupted rather than fear-imposed, making victims complicit in their own exploitation. Yet the mathematical impossibilities that had troubled her methodical mind remained unresolved by Mrs. Carmichael's explanations. The letters might indeed document a 40-year relationship of financial coercion, but their placement in the sewing basket represented a much more recent decision by someone who understood both the correspondence's explosive potential and the precise timing required to deploy it effectively. The pattern emerges. The breakthrough came through Mrs. Hartwell's increasingly detailed recollections, sharpened by anxiety, into uncomfortable clarity about events she had initially dismissed as insignificant. Her memory of the harvest fete's preparation revealed that Mrs. Pemberton had shown unusual interest in the handicraft stall's arrangement, particularly the positioning of Miss Greenway's sewing basket as the display's centerpiece. More troubling was Mrs. Hartwell's belated realization that Mrs. Pemberton had guided her discovery of the letters with subtle suggestions about examining the basket's beautiful silk lining and checking whether the deeper compartments contained additional treasures. Inspector Craddock's more systematic investigation of Mrs. Pemberton's background revealed a woman whose apparent respectability concealed a history of strategic relocations that coincided suspiciously with various local scandals. Her 20 years in St. Mary Mead represented the longest period she had remained in any single community. suggesting either genuine contentment or the sort of patience required for elaborate, long-term planning. More significantly, her previous residences had all experienced mysterious revelations of local secrets that had invariably enhanced her own social position while destroying potential rivals. The pattern that emerged was one of sophisticated social manipulation conducted with the precision of a chess master, planning moves years in advance. Mrs. Pemberton had established herself as a pillar of community respectability while systematically collecting information about her neighbors' vulnerabilities, using that knowledge to orchestrate situations where she appeared to be the innocent party in other people's dramas, while eliminating anyone who might threaten her carefully constructed position. The orchestrated discovery. Miss Marple's careful examination of the physical evidence revealed details that had been overlooked in the initial excitement of discovery. The silk linings restitching, while clearly recent, showed the particular technique of someone working quickly but with considerable skill. Not the desperate haste of concealment, but the confident efficiency of someone executing a well-rehearsed plan. More tellingly, the letters themselves showed signs of careful handling that suggested they had been examined and arranged before their supposed discovery, with the most damaging correspondence positioned for maximum impact when the basket was opened. The brass key and its accompanying note represented the most sophisticated element of the deception. Mrs. Pemberton had clearly known about Mrs. Carmichael's true identity and her deposit box arrangements, using that knowledge to create evidence that would appear to confirm guilt while actually serving to frame an innocent party. The timing of the key's placement, sometime between Miss Greenway's death and the harvest fete, suggested someone with both access to the deceased's possessions and detailed knowledge of the family's financial arrangements. Dr. Sanford's professional observations provided crucial context for understanding Mrs. Pemberton's methods. His visits to various patients over the years had revealed a curious pattern of anxiety that seemed to center around Mrs. Pemberton's involvement in their affairs. People who had initially welcomed her helpful interest in their problems had gradually developed the sort of nervous conditions that suggested ongoing stress about matters they felt unable to discuss openly, creating a network of psychologically dependent relationships that could be manipulated when necessary. The final revelation. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the village green, Miss Marple reflected on the particular cruelty of those who weaponized community feeling for personal advantage. Mrs. Pemberton had not written the letters. They were genuine correspondence documenting a real relationship between the Greenway sisters. But she had discovered their existence, perhaps during one of her helpful visits to the ailing Miss Greenway, and had recognized their potential as weapons that could be deployed when circumstances required the elimination of inconvenient rivals. The orchestrated discovery at the harvest fete represented the culmination of months of careful planning, designed to destroy Mrs. Carmichael's reputation while positioning Mrs. Pemberton as the shocked but righteous community member who had helped expose such scandalous behavior. The mathematical timeline that had troubled Miss Marple was now explained. The letters had indeed existed for 40 years, but their placement in the sewing basket was a recent tactical decision by someone who understood that the most effective lies were those built around kernels of demonstrable truth. Inspector Craddock, reviewing his notes with growing appreciation for Miss Marple's insights, began to understand that they were dealing with someone whose greatest skill lay in making others believe that her victims were responsible for their own destruction. The challenge now lay in proving criminal intent by someone who had made manipulation into an art form, leaving no obvious fingerprints on the psychological weapons she deployed with such devastating effectiveness. The sewing basket sat in the vicarage study, its brass fittings gleaming innocently in the lamplight, while the real architect of the village's troubles continued to present herself as a concerned citizen shocked by revelations that had torn apart such a respectable family. The game, Miss Marple realized with characteristic understatement, was approaching its most dangerous phase. the moment when a cornered predator might abandon subtlety for more direct methods of eliminating threats to their carefully constructed world. Sunday morning brought Inspector Craddock to Miss Marple's cottage with the particular gravity of a man who understood that conventional evidence would prove insufficient against someone whose greatest skill lay in making manipulations appear as neighborly concern. The mathematical impossibility that had troubled Miss Marple throughout the investigation now demanded direct confrontation, though she understood that Mrs. Pemberton's psychological armor would require the most delicate approach to penetrate effectively. The opportunity presented itself through the church vestry, where Miss Marple had arranged for the altar linens to require urgent attention before evening service. Mrs. Pemberton arrived with her customary efficiency, bringing needle and thread along with the sort of helpful competence that had served her so well in orchestrating other people's downfalls. The setting was perfect for Miss Marple's purposes. Intimate, respectable, and offering the sort of practical work that would occupy hands while minds engaged in more dangerous activities. Such beautiful silk lining in Miss Greenway's basket, Miss Marple observed as they settled to their mending, her tone carrying the gentle admiration of someone discussing a particularly fine piece of needlework. Though I confess the repair work puzzled me somewhat. The stitching was so different from Lavinia's usual perfectionism, more hurried, and with that particular leftward slant that one sees in left-handed seamstresses working quickly. Mrs. Pemberton's needle paused almost imperceptibly before resuming its steady rhythm. "I'm sure I wouldn't know about such technical matters," she replied, though her voice carried a slight edge that hadn't been present moments before. Miss Marple continued her gentle examination, producing a small piece of rose-pink silk and a threaded needle. "I wonder if you might indulge an old woman's curiosity. I've been trying to remember exactly how that repair was executed. The overcast seemed to slant just so." She demonstrated a rightward tilt, then paused thoughtfully. "Or perhaps it was the other direction entirely. My memory isn't what it once was." The request was so innocuous, so perfectly reasonable, that refusal would have seemed churlish. Mrs. Pemberton accepted the needle with her left hand and executed a series of neat, overcast stitches that slanted unmistakably leftward. Quick, competent work that matched exactly the hasty repair Miss Marple had discovered in the sewing basket's lining. "How perfectly you've captured it," Miss Marple said with genuine admiration. "Exactly like the work we found, though it does raise the most curious question about timing, doesn't it?" Mrs. Pemberton's composure, so carefully maintained through years of practice, began to show hairline cracks. "I'm sure I don't understand what you mean." "Well," Miss Marple continued with the patient persistence of someone working through a particularly complex pattern, "Mrs. Hartwell was quite specific that Miss Greenway acquired that walnut basket 15 years ago at the estate sale in Little Wickham. Yet the letters span nearly 40 years, with the earliest dated 1943. The arithmetic is rather troubling, don't you think?" The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of church bells beginning their evening peal. Mrs. Pemberton's hands, usually so steady, trembled as she set down her needle with excessive care. "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested gently, "someone discovered those letters during one of their helpful visits to poor Lavinia, recognized their explosive potential, and decided they would serve admirably as weapons when the right moment arrived. The harvest fate provided such perfect timing, maximum exposure, minimum opportunity for private resolution." Mrs. Pemberton's carefully constructed facade finally cracked under the weight of Miss Marple's relentless logic. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice carrying decades of accumulated resentment. "People like Venetia Carmichael, with their diplomatic connections and social advantages, they think they can waltz into communities like ours and assume positions that others have earned through years of service. Someone needed to show the village what sort of person they were really dealing with." The confession, when it came, revealed the full scope of Mrs. Pemberton's psychological manipulation. She had indeed discovered the letters during her visits to the ailing Miss Greenway, immediately recognizing their potential for destroying Mrs. Carmichael's reputation while positioning herself as the shocked but righteous community member who had helped expose such scandalous behavior. The restitching of the basket's lining, the careful placement of the letters for maximum impact, the orchestrated discovery at the fete, all had been calculated to eliminate a rival whose sophistication threatened her carefully constructed position as the village's moral arbiter. As Inspector Craddock arrived to complete the formal procedures, Miss Marple reflected on the particular tragedy of those who transformed community service into personal warfare. The genuine correspondence between the Greenway sisters had documented real family conflict, but that authentic pain had been weaponized by someone who understood that the most effective lies were built around kernels of demonstrable truth. The sewing basket sat innocently on the vestry table, its brass fittings gleaming in the lamplight, while the real architect of the village's troubles finally faced the consequences of treating human relationships as raw material for her own advancement. The pattern, Miss Marple observed with characteristic understatement, had finally revealed its true design. Monday morning arrived in St. Mary Mead with the particular quality of light that follows thunderstorms, clearer somehow, as though the air itself had been washed clean of accumulated tensions. The village settled into its familiar rhythms with the resilient efficiency that had seen it through centuries of human folly, though conversations at garden gates carried a subdued note that spoke of trust, requiring careful tending before it could flourish again. Inspector Craddock's final interview with Mrs. Pemberton took place in the vicarage study, where she sat with the deflated appearance of someone whose carefully constructed world had collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. Her confession, delivered with alternating defiance and self-pity, revealed the full scope of her 20-year campaign to position herself as St. Mary Mead's moral arbiter, while systematically eliminating anyone who might threaten that carefully cultivated authority. The letters, she admitted, had been discovered during her ostensibly helpful visits to the ailing Miss Greenway, who had inadvertently revealed their hiding place during moments of confusion about Violet's constant demands and the burden of family obligations. Mrs. Pemberton had recognized their explosive potential immediately, understanding that authentic family secrets made the most effective weapons precisely because they contained enough truth to be believed without question. Her methodology had been sophisticated in its psychological precision. The careful restitching of the sewing basket's lining, the strategic placement of the correspondence for maximum impact, the orchestrated timing of the discovery to coincide with maximum community exposure. Even Mrs. Hartwell's emotional reaction had been anticipated and incorporated into the theatrical production, transforming an innocent woman into an unwitting accomplice in character assassination. The pattern revealed. Miss Marple, observing the proceedings with her characteristic attention to human psychology, noted how Mrs. Pemberton's greatest skill had been her ability to make manipulation appear as community service. Her years of helpful visits, committee chairmanships, and moral pronouncements had provided perfect cover for gathering intelligence about her neighbors' vulnerabilities while positioning herself as indispensable to village life. The brass key and deposit box arrangement represented the most calculated element of her deception. Through careful research and Miss Greenway's declining mental state, she had obtained access to financial records that confirmed Mrs. Carmichael's true identity while providing additional evidence to support the blackmail narrative. The key's placement in the sewing basket had been timed to provide what she termed irrefutable proof of guilt when the scandal reached its crescendo. Inspector Craddock's charges, attempting to pervert the course of justice, theft of private correspondence, and elaborate fraud, reflected the particular challenges of prosecuting someone whose primary weapons were psychological rather than physical. Yet the evidence was comprehensive enough to ensure appropriate legal consequences for crimes that had poisoned community relationships through years of subtle manipulation, restoration, and reflection. Mrs. Venetia Carmichael's quiet return from London proceeded with the careful courtesy that marked genuine attempts at reconciliation. Her meeting with Miss Marple, conducted over weak tea and honest conversation, revealed someone who understood that family relationships built on financial obligation inevitably corrupted the very bonds they claimed to preserve. Her decision to close the deposit box and redirect remaining funds to charitable purposes represented not penance but practical wisdom about the mathematics of human relationships. The village's collective embarrassment at being so thoroughly deceived was tempered by recognition that Mrs. Pemberton's methods had been sophisticated enough to fool people far more experienced in detecting deception. Dr. Sanford observed with professional interest how quickly nervous conditions improved once their psychological sources were removed, while Mrs. Hartwell's campaign of penitential helpfulness gradually evolved into genuine community service rather than anxious overcompensation. The sewing basket itself, restored to the church vestry and filled with ordinary supplies, resumed its intended function as a practical tool rather than a theatrical prop. Mrs. Saintsbury's announcement of regular mending afternoons provided the community with constructive activity while ensuring that future needlework would be conducted under many watchful eyes, and none too curious about hidden compartments or mysterious correspondence. As autumn deepened toward winter, Miss Marple reflected on the particular satisfaction that came from seeing complex patterns finally revealed in their true design. The mystery had indeed centered on secrets folded inside the walnut sewing basket, but the most dangerous ones had belonged not to its ostensible owners, but to someone who understood that the best hiding places for criminal intent were often in plain sight, disguised as moral authority and community concern. The village green showed its usual complement of children and dogs, washing lines and garden gates, while the church bells marked time with their ancient reliability. Human nature, Miss Marple observed from her cottage window, possessed remarkable resilience when faced with truth honestly acknowledged. St. Mary Mead would heal, as it always did, through the simple expedient of people choosing to trust again despite having every reason for caution. The secret folded inside the sewing basket, she decided, had never really been about letters or blackmail or even family betrayal. It had been about the particular corruption that occurred when community service became personal warfare, when helpfulness transformed into manipulation, and when the desire to manage other people's lives overwhelmed the simple wisdom of tending one's own garden with honest care. Tomorrow there would be fresh bread at the baker's, letters at the post office, and the comfortable rhythm of village life continuing its ancient patterns. Some lessons, Miss Marple reflected, were best learned quietly and remembered without fanfare, like well-executed stitches that held firm under pressure while remaining nearly invisible to casual observation. Christmas Eve arrived in St. Mary Mead with the particular quality of light that transforms even ordinary cottages into something approaching enchantment, the winter air carrying the promise of renewal that marked the season's ancient rhythms. Miss Marple sat in her favorite armchair, her knitting needles moving with their customary precision as she worked on a christening shawl for Dr. Sanford's newest patient, young Mrs. Henderson's first child, born with the excellent timing that suggested a lifetime of consideration for others. The village had settled into its familiar winter patterns with the resilient grace that marked communities accustomed to weathering storms, both meteorological and human. Conversations still carried occasional references to that business with the sewing basket, delivered in the hushed tones reserved for cautionary tales, but the sharp edge of scandal had dulled into something approaching useful wisdom, justice, and resolution. The legal proceedings had concluded with the sort of measured justice that satisfied both official requirements and community needs. Mrs. Pemberton's sentence, 18 months for fraud in attempting to pervert the course of justice, reflected judicial recognition that psychological manipulation, while difficult to prosecute, caused damage every bit as real as physical crimes. Her departure from St. Mary Mead had been accomplished with discreet efficiency, marking the end of an unfortunate chapter rather than providing dramatic conclusion to village melodrama. Inspector Craddock's final report, filed with characteristic thoroughness, noted that the case demonstrated how authentic evidence could be weaponized by those who understood the difference between truth and its strategic deployment. The brass key now resided in official files, though its real significance lay in reminding investigators that the most dangerous secrets were often those used as weapons against the innocent. Healing and understanding. Mrs. Venetia Carmichael had remained in the village, her presence gradually transforming from source of speculation into simple fact of community life. Her expertise in antique furnishings, now acknowledged as genuine rather than fabricated, had proved valuable in cataloging the church's historical treasures. More significantly, her quiet competence in organizing charitable activities demonstrated the difference between authentic service and its manipulative counterfeit, a distinction that several villagers found instructive in retrospect. Dr. Sanford's observations provided professional confirmation of what Miss Marple had noted through more intuitive means. The nervous conditions that had plagued several residents throughout Mrs. Pemberton's tenure had largely resolved themselves once their psychological sources were eliminated, demonstrating how thoroughly one person's manipulation could poison an entire community's emotional atmosphere. The handicraft stall continued its charitable work under Mrs. Saintsbury's capable management, though the walnut sewing basket had been retired from display purposes and returned to practical use in the vestry. Regular mending afternoons had evolved into genuinely popular social occasions where needlework provided pleasant occupation, while conversation ranged over topics both serious and trivial, conducted under the comfortable supervision of many eyes and no hidden agendas. Wisdom gained. Miss Marple found particular satisfaction in observing how the community had absorbed their recent experience without becoming paralyzed by suspicion. Trust, she reflected, was like fine needlework, delicate enough to be damaged by careless handling, but strong enough to withstand considerable stress when properly constructed and maintained with appropriate care. The relationship between the Greenway sisters, such as it was, had been laid to rest with Miss Greenway's earthly remains in the churchyard. Mrs. Carmichael's decision to place winter roses on her sister's grave each Sunday spoke of forgiveness rather than obligation, suggesting that some family wounds could indeed heal when sources of infection were finally removed. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the village green, Miss Marple contemplated the particular satisfaction that came from seeing complex human patterns finally revealed in their true design. Mrs. Pemberton's greatest skill had been her ability to transform community service into personal warfare while maintaining the appearance of moral authority. Her downfall had come not through dramatic confrontation, but through patient application of logic to inconsistencies that revealed themselves when examined with sufficient care. The village children played their eternal games, while their parents exchanged season's greetings with genuine warmth, demonstrating humanity's remarkable capacity for renewal when faced with truth honestly acknowledged. The church bells marked time with ancient reliability, calling the faithful to evening service where candles would illuminate faces, touched with contentment that came from surviving difficulties through mutual support rather than individual cunning. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked steadily in the gathering dusk, their rhythm matching eternal patterns of creation and repair that marked both needlework and human relationships. The secret folded inside the sewing basket had ultimately been about the difference between authentic community and its carefully constructed counterfeit, a lesson worth learning, remembering, and passing on to future generations who would face similar challenges with their own variations of eternal human themes. Tomorrow would bring Christmas morning, with its promise of renewal and reminder that the most valuable gifts were often those given without expectation of return.